Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's technology information session hosted by Energy Security Services North America, Inc., for short, ESSNA, on repositioning the oil and gas sector through an end-to-end decarbonization approach, delivering net positive revenue streams. My name is Sohail Askarpour. I'm PTAC President and CEO. And our presenter today is Mr. Gareth Gregory. So welcome, Gareth. Before I ask Gareth to make his presentation, I will go over a safety moment and ask essentially to you guys pay attention to a few housekeeping items. Well, as COVID is still present, we really encourage everyone to continue to follow public health advisory and hope everyone and their loved one are going to be safe. The format of today's presentation or event, we would start with the presentation by Gareth. Then you will have the opportunity to pose your questions, and I think you can use chat box for that. And then after the presentation, essentially, when we end the program, there would be an email sent to each of you asking to evaluate the performance of today's event. Also, the PowerPoint presentation that you are going to be seeing will be posted and on our website, etc. So you will be able to have access to it and review it. The other thing I just want to talk to you about it is the event that we have coming November 1st till November 4th is a 4-day event. It's about methane and net zero. The first day would be on CCUS, the second and third is on methane, and the fourth day is on hydrogen, which is actually would be a topic that we are going to be discussing today. Let you know that we have already close to 500 people have registered for this event, so we are hoping that we are going to have much higher number of people kind of registering. So if you haven't registered, I would encourage you to do so. We have really good keynote speakers. The Minister of Alberta Environment and Parks, Minister Nixon will be would open the conference. We would have Deputy Minister of Alberta Environment and Parks, Ms. Yi, would be our keynote speaker for the second day. The third day, Ms. Actually Helen from ECCC will be. She is the Assistant Deputy Minister, will be our keynote speaker. And then the fourth day, we would have Mr. David Lizal that would talk about hydrogen as keynote speaker. You will be able to see actually the list of all of the presenters is a really impressive list. So some background information on ESSNA. This ESSNA is represented in South Africa and Canada, specialized in energy modeling and planning, and is operating in the utility and manufacturing, mining, industrial, commercial, oil and gas, and high-density domestic markets. They design, fund, build, commission, and operate successful end-to-end bankable energy solutions and gas applications, hydrogen, using innovative and proprietary methodologies within a customized energy model to satisfy core business objectives. In many cases, decarbonization is a key factor running in parallel to cost rationalization. Those are really, when you look at it, those are the two key factors that right now for net zero, we all need to work on. The ESSNA hydrogen business is developed through a dedicated 59 hydrogen TM division in South Africa and North America. The services range from electricity to heating and process gas applications. And some information about Gareth himself. He is the North American head, strategic energy, client delivery, and 59hydrogen.com TM at ESSNA. He is accountable for the establishment, stabilization, and growth of the North American operation in the field of decarbonization, energy modeling, planning, and 59hydrogen TM. Gareth's experience is building innovative decarbonization approaches for medium and large clients. His experience includes scenario planning, energy modeling, design, regulatory compliance, funding, building, commissioning, and operations of hydrogen plant, essentially everything. Gareth's experience extends to financial and technical areas, including energy economics, policy, modeling, planning, technology, as well as the geographic and political aspects of energy. So with that introduction, I would like to welcome Gareth to make his presentation. So Gareth, you have the floor.
Great, Sohail, thank you very much for that introduction, and a warm welcome to all the participants attending this online session today. And once again, just to reiterate, everything we do and what we'd like to share today has to do with collaboration on the one end, but on the other end, it's really all about an integrated approach. And if we miss a part of the integration in terms of developing and driving that value proposition, you generally have a less than satisfactory outcome and a very expensive outcome in terms of reinvestment of CapEx over the next 3 to 5 year period as you try and meet your decarbonization objectives, net zero, and repositioning your business within the oil and gas sector to achieve a net positive revenue stream. In terms of structure of the presentation today, there will certainly be a Q&A session, and please, we welcome a collaborative discussion as opposed to just a one-side dictation from our side. We're really interested in your thoughts and your opinions, so we'll call on you through the course of the presentation. There will be 2 polls represented during the presentation. Please participate in the poll. It's some really important information in terms of how we're thinking about decarbonization and where this is heading. Our presentation today is somewhat technical, but it's certainly less technical and more in terms of driving the fundamental business model to get decarbonization over the line, number one, but most importantly, achieving those net positive revenue streams. With it being a small group, it also allows us to participate and interact a bit more freely. And we work with a range of clients, and these clients are end-use clients in some respects. In other aspects, they are upstream, such as specific oil and gas companies. And we do also work with other consulting firms and other energy companies in terms of resolving complex decarbonization requirements for various types of clients. So just before we get started, I had asked my team to do a broad sweep across the market and just get a bit of an update as to some of the discussion that's going on in terms of decarbonization. And I think this really supports the notion of the complexity around decarbonization and what that actually means. So first of all, there's consensus that there's going to be a level of net zero or level of neutrality by 2050. And that's, of course, with the reduction in the use of fossil fuel. One of the key elements coming out of that is, of course, the sustained use of natural gas or LNG. And the reason for that is that it's got a smaller footprint in terms of emissions, but nonetheless, the emissions are certainly relevant. There seems to be a lot of misconception that possibly scope 1 and 2 emissions are far more important than scope 3 emissions. That's certainly not true, as scope 3 emissions can contribute between 40 to 60% of your footprint, of your emissions, of your carbon footprint. So that's something we found quite interesting, that there's so much focus on scope 1 and 2, but scope 3 is usually left by the wayside. There's also a push in terms of long-term targets, but if we haven't sorted out our short to medium play, how are we going to get the long-term perspective in check? So that was another interesting outcome from some of the research that we've done recently, and we do this quite often, just to understand what's happening within the market around the world. And then there's definitely a drive in terms of some governments as well as regulators to achieve levels of decarbonization through influencing demand, as opposed to a stick and an aggressive type of approach in terms of regulation. The regulation and policy will come in time, but it's all about uptake by the end user within those markets. Generation Z is playing an increasing role in terms of decarbonization, and where that demand is coming from to decarbonize. Which is really a great point, because one of the things we're going to demonstrate to you today, that decarbonization is a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach. And then one or two last points here. In terms of the increase in natural gas share of energy generation or electricity generation, that will certainly increase and will stabilize on a plateau that's due to the fact it's got a slightly lower footprint. But nonetheless, there is a concerted effort to still find the right type of strategy to rather mitigate carbonization or drive a decarbonization strategy rather sooner than later. I think one of the very important things with LNG, liquefied natural gas, has to do with the concept of energy return on energy invested. You're obviously dropping the temperature there to achieve your LNG position, and that's not always all that favorable in terms of utilizing such a medium in your operations, as it will drive your emissions up exponentially. If you looked at the whole cradle to grave position in terms of decarbonization, there's no doubt that steam methane reforming, producing hydrogen, is identified as a core emissions mitigator for industry. And we'll touch on some aspects around a low carbon supply, which is very attainable, and it's something that we are already starting to deliver today to certain levels of clients. And then just 3 quick points. You know, there's so much focus in terms of ESG reporting, etc., but we need valuable data to get there first. And of course, the importance of integrating emissions costs into business decisions. Well, is it just a cash outflow, or is there an opportunity to really develop a net cash inflow here and make it an additional revenue stream within your business? And that's what we're talking about today, delivering that net positive revenue stream within the oil and gas sector. And then last but certainly not least, it's all about building a portfolio that is resilient, that is sustainable. And one of the aspects around oil and gas in Alberta is that it's been extremely volatile over many, many decades. And you've got to ask yourself the question, if the onset of decarbonization is not maybe the catalyst now to achieving a bit more of a sustainable industry by adapting some of the fundamental business models that have been in place and are sincerely outdated, being sort of 60, 70, 80 years old in 2021. So that was a bit of research that our team had conducted as to what's currently happening, and we'll kick off with the balance of the presentation now. So effectively, what do we do? Well, first of all, we're a specialist energy modeling and planning company. A lot of our projects are delivered on a BOOT model, which is build, own, operate. And in some cases, we do transfer that particular facility over, all depending on if we operate in public or private sector, and of course, the intentions of the particular client that we're dealing with. The whole aspect around net zero and decarbonization, in excess of 80% of our business now in North America, and in particular Alberta, is focused on decarbonization. So due to our strengths in energy modeling and our ability to develop highly accurate scenarios and high probabilities of those scenarios materializing, we managed to achieve a great and a very successful level of decarbonization. 59 Hydrogen is a brand that we own, although we're technology agnostic in our energy modeling process. We do own a level of IP in our hydrogen-based solutions. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, certainly a critical part of anything that we develop. And we've got some highly innovative solutions in terms of mitigating emissions, capturing the carbon earlier on, both pre as well as post-combustion. And we're having some great successes out of that. Then in terms of energy on site without CapEx, we have got a fully fledged funding option for the development of decarbonization and decarbonize strategies. That will become evident why that is important within the next 2 to 3 slides. And then the whole commercial and technical innovation, decarbonization, investment and entrepreneurship really pinpoints ESSNA's drive on the North American continent. And it's no different for sub-Saharan Africa. We're certainly developing quite a niche for ourselves. So that's a bit of overview. This is not a branding exercise whatsoever, and we're going to start moving into some hardcore fundamentals now in terms of decarbonization and driving that net revenue stream for the oil and gas sector. If there are any questions during the presentation, I'm quite sure you can raise a hand electronically, or write the question down, put it into the chat group, and we'll address the questions as we go along. So this first slide deals with the whole aspect around misaligned decarbonization objectives. And the reason that is important is that there's a huge amount of complexity around decarbonization. And when we refer to complexity, it's not a single point of complexity that's creating a challenge. It's multiple points of complexity. And the whole purpose of today is seeing what is the smooth path moving forward. What are the logical steps to try and mitigate the complexity that we're currently experiencing? And one of the core drivers in terms of misaligned decarbonization objectives has to do with the top-down approach. And that's actually one of the greatest challenges that many industries and sectors are facing today, is that the decisions around decarbonization are taking place top-down, but the market is driving them bottom-up. So is it about a product? Is it about a single type of technology? Well, technology plays a role, but if you're trying to mitigate your emissions exposure and you're trying to drive a decarbonization program in terms of a single type of technology or product, you are more than likely heading down an avenue where you're going to be reinvesting every 3 to 7 years. The technology or the product plays a critical role. There's no doubt about that. But it has to be as a result of a fully developed decarbonized model that obviously gives you that particular value proposition. Is it just about methodology? We believe the methodology is a big part of it, but of course there's a number of other aspects. So what we need to try and determine today is what are some of the core aspects that are creating the complexity? What are the root causes as opposed to the issues? Because many issues can be resolved by resolving one root cause. And let's try and understand what those root causes are today. Then 2 of the themes that are going to be running through the presentation today. In the interim, decarbonization is a non-core business activity for many companies. And in the interim, once again, it's a non-core CapEx allocation activity within companies, and that also creates a level of complexity. So what does that mean? We need to try and package this somehow, and we believe in terms of our experience and the methodology that's been delivered to multiple clients across various sectors, there is a very specific packaging methodology and strategy that can be applied to achieve core decarbonization objectives. Just before we move on, I'm going to ask Mary Leanne to post the first poll, and I'd like you to take 2 minutes, participate in the poll. And what we're trying to achieve here, we want to understand, in terms of your opinion, what impact will decarbonization have on your business or your clients over the next 60 months? Is it a minimal impact, some adjusted but manageable? Is it greater than minimal disruption and you need a level of control? Will it impact the going concern of your company and or your client? and may only be a burden on local government, provincially and or nationally. So I'll leave that with you over the next short while, and we'll see what the results look like there. Right. So when we talk about global disorder of decarbonization, we're really talking about uncertainty as to what decarbonization actually is. So if we go back 90, 100 years, possibly even a bit further back, Thomas Edison stated that we'll make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn candles. But at that point in time, we didn't quite understand the generation points of electricity and what that may evolve into within coming decades. Then we had a perspective from a gentleman by the name of Larry Burns, who's actively involved in mobile hydrogen. And he stated that he doesn't believe that the hydrogen economy depends on a carbon economy at all. Well, if that is the case, what is then the core catalyst or core driver in terms of that particular hydrogen economy? And third, we've got a perspective that states, and this is a gentleman by the name of Lewis Pugh. Some of you may know him as the Arctic swimmer. He's a gentleman that swims in minus 1.7 degrees Celsius water temperature, and he does it in a speedo, right? So he stated, we make fracking a civil rights issue because that is what it is. We all have a right to a healthy environment and to clean water, and so do our children. So very interesting. Could it be a civil rights issue that we're currently dealing with? Right, so out of the poll, if we have a look at what we posted, 50% of the audience stated that it's greater than minimal disruption that's coming and there needs to be a need to control. 33% of the audience stated that they will impact the going concern of their own company and or their client. So that's quite serious. So it means it's a fatal event that's coming up. And then 17% of the audience stated that there may be minimal impact. And that's really a big part of the discussion today as to how we manage this. So once again, it's all about packaging that solution, having clear parameters around decarbonization and understanding what that means for different stakeholders. So if we have a look at the left-hand side of the slide, we've divided this slide up into 3 different areas. And we've divided it up between a 50% decarbonization scenario, and we're stating maybe a company or an oil and gas company that stated that they will take a bit more of a conservative approach and only decarbonize their current portfolio or try and achieve that net zero position through a 50% participation in terms of the decarbonization approaches that are currently available. We then had a look at, well, what does it mean in terms of a 75% decarbonization scenario? And that is this the second graph over here. And this is live data coming out of many of our projects, both predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa today, but certainly starting to contribute through the North American geography. And we had a look at this and we stated, well, look, 50 or 75% is very much an unbalanced scenario. And what is the reason for that? And in more cases than not, we find that there's usually a single type of technology approach that is at play. So a company would look at possibly just a specific type of decarbonization technology or decarbonized feedstock, but they're not building out an energy mix. So there's an absence of an energy mix in terms of that strategy that's been developed for deployment within the market. They've got a threshold, and I'm going to discuss this in the next 2 slides, which is a 75% plus 1 threshold that they're not achieving. So it means that they're operating within the 50 or up to 75%, not 75% plus 1, in terms of decarbonization decisions that they're making. We find that they are completely focused on a very traditional market in terms of offtake. That offtake of your product will change because your product is going to be changing fundamentally, and the application of the product will grow exponentially. Referring back to hydrogen for half a minute, we currently operate across 12 different sectors in terms of hydrogen application. Out of the 12 sectors that we operate within, 4 of them are highly active today in terms of hydrogen consumption, but the ability through hydrogenation, etc., to apply hydrogen to many different types of aspects, especially a low carbon hydrogen, is starting to grow exponentially. A lot of these clients that fall in the first 2 categories have a lot of big data available. We've got clients in the oil gas sector that have somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 data points, but that's what it is. It is big data, it's scope 1, and the billion-dollar question is always how to convert the data into information. There's an absence of a decarbonization revenue stream, and the reason for that is that decarbonization is still thought of as a cash outflow in the organization and not a net positive cash inflow. In terms of an on-balance sheet approach, the question that these companies are starting to ask themselves is, should we be investing on our balance sheet in non-core operational assets relative to our traditional business? And that we'll discuss shortly, and that's a very important decision as many decarbonization activities are relatively complex and they need the utmost attention to be resolved. So being on balance sheet, you're pretty much taking 100% ownership over that, and you need to make a decision if that's really the correct avenue that you should be heading down. And then a partial value proposition really speaks to that 50% decarbonization scenario. You're not covering that decarbonization strategy end to end. You're actually just looking at a small portion of it. And maybe as a result of looking at aspects purely in terms of a signal technology and not as an integrated energy mix to get the most out of that. And then on the bottom left-hand side, we're not going to read this out in terms of risk, but it's all about the non-core business and the non-core CapEx allocation to decarbonization, which is becoming problematic for many companies, and that's why they fit in this 50 to 75% range. Mary Leanne, I think if we could just flash poll 2 quickly before we move on to the next slide. So the question here is, what is the most relevant catalyst for decarbonization adoption within your organization or with your clients? Is it about no relevance and no need for decarbonization? Is it about a policy-based stimulus? Is it about taxation in terms of carbon tax? Is it the belief that decarbonization is a civil rights issue? Or is it possibly an economic stimulus? So targeted fiscal and monetary policy, or are you fundamentally unsure? And in terms of some of the participation, we'll just give this a second. And some of the results that are coming through here, we're close on the 100% mark now. 14% state that there's no relevance and there's no need for decarbonization. And again, if that is a top-bottom approach, I think you're relatively safe. If it's a bottom-up approach, you can manage the situation, but you don't necessarily have any control over it. So that we need to determine today, is decarbonization a top-down approach or is it a bottom-up approach? In terms of policy, fully agree. I mean, policy needs to play a role. But some of the best policy in the world is a half-developed policy, and you allow the market to develop and position the balance of that policy to get traction. Taxation, sure, it's certainly a mechanism to drive decarbonization. 29% of the audience feel that taxation could be relevant, almost dead split between policy as well as taxation. No one in the audience believes that it's a civil rights issue, but if you understand the African continent, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa, you'd understand that there's a lot of civil rights considerations around decarbonization, and a decision that's made in North America or even just in Alberta has a profound effect in terms of global impact. And then economic stimulus, targeted fiscal and monetary policy. Sure, that's part of the equation. And you got to ask yourself the question: what is the most relevant catalyst in terms of what we're looking at here? So having a look at the next positioning now around the complexity of decarbonization, we can have a look at companies that have taken great strides in trying to resolve their emissions position. And they've got technology as a result of a very detailed energy model or decarbonization model that's been developed. So that box is ticked. They have an integrated energy mix across their portfolio, and that's starting to make a lot of sense in terms of the amount of energy going in and the amount of emissions that are being developed both pre and post combustion, and of course what's happening in terms of the targeted market that is off-taking that particular product. We've got a dynamic offtake within the market. So some of the products that have been produced by that oil and gas company have been repositioned. And we're seeing here that we're getting some level of gain here. So from a 50% decarbonization scenario, we're starting to move closer to a 75% decarbonization scenario. And we possibly have the addition of 1 or 2 decarbonized revenue streams. And we're starting to look at this from an off-balance sheet position. And when we state that there's billions of dollars available for decarbonization, there truly is, right? All there needs to be a bankable decarbonization project. So it's something we allocate on a regular basis. We've got a lot of funding available, but it has to be a bankable decarbonized project for it to be applicable. The whole aspect of our partial value proposition, we'll leave like that for now. And of course, data to information, and now including scope 3, and scope 3 can contribute 40 to 60% of your total emissions, which is pretty dramatic. So if you've got an LNG supply or you've got a different type of feedstock where there's a huge carbon component in terms of the cradle to grave calculation as to what is the net or the cumulative emission from point of origination right up to the point of use, you'll find that you're actually in a very serious and very detrimental and high risk emissions position if you're not taking scope 3 into account. But the most important thing here is that the threshold of that 75% plus 1 in terms of making that decision, that your threshold in terms of decarbonization meets that 75% plus a bit, right, to ensure your sustainability is absolutely key, and that's not being achieved yet. So your business would run, and it will actually reverse back, it will take steps back into the red again in terms of decarbonization, because you wouldn't have kept up with the decarbonization strategy. There would be insufficient sustainability to move you forward as those thresholds start intensifying externally around you, as the demands of the market start pushing through ever harder every quarter and every year in terms of driving that decarbonization decision within your company. So that's one of the biggest driving factors, that as much effort as what you put in over a period of time, you're going to be in a very detrimental position after that initial period if you have not met that particular threshold, the golden number of 75% plus 1. And we've tested this in many different ways. And the reason that this graph goes back all the way to 2019 is that we've had active projects where we've looked at companies that have divorced themselves from the municipal grid due to the energy security risk associated with that particular geography. And the outcome out of that is that if you don't make sufficient investment up front and meet at least a 75 plus 1 threshold, you're going to be in a very serious situation and a high risk situation around decarbonization. So that's why our data set goes so far back, but we've got some very current decarbonization data integrated into this that gives you these particular results. And again, data to information without scope 3 certainly ends up being red. And once again, non-core business, non-core CapEx, you are deviating from your business. It feels very unnatural to be driving decarbonization if you're extracting gas and oil. And that's why an arm's length partner with funding, with CapEx investment, is probably one of the better decisions that could be major. So if we need a bit of practical reference as to what is the legitimacy as to what we're actually stating here, well, first of all, it was a US first that there was a historic ban on fossil fuel refineries. And this could have far-reaching effects and consequences in terms of big oil. So this is as early as July 2021, and it's all about municipal control, and that's the municipality of Whatcom County Council. And the reason that this is so dangerous is, again, it's the bottom-up approach, right? It's not the corporation making that decision anymore. And that's as early as July 2021. We can reference another project, which was the Grassy Mountain Coal Project, cancelled by federal government, August 2021. We can reference a $14 billion LNG export project cancelled, right, on our doorstep, citing environmental concerns, again, July 2021. My team has pulled together a list of at least another 16 examples as to where this is relevant. So even if you believe in decarbonization or not today, that horse has bolted, and the market is going to dictate as to what's going to be happening and what type of product you need to be producing and at what decarbonized level for you to remain relevant within the market. So taking all this into account, the basis of the problem here is that it's a top-down approach today, and it's not a bottom-up approach. Secondly, it's got to do with the absence of a package, and this reality of the risk, the way you mitigate this risk is through that all-integrated encompassing package that we're starting to have a phenomenal amount of success with clients within the oil and gas sector, as well as a number of other sectors, really simplifying this complex problem, getting down to the fundamental root causes as to what needs to be done and when it needs to be done to achieve those specific thresholds and some of the other fundamentals that we've been talking about. And of course, the reason that this is successful is that it's a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach, which is absolutely key. So clients that are working through the process with us, they will have increase in revenue within 36 months between 25 and 42% of today's levels. Admittedly, the oil and gas sector had been suppressed to some extent in recent months, but we've certainly been very cautious in terms of our analysis and our data that we're dealing with to remove some of the significant outliers, and we've looked at taking averages over an extended period of time. So the clients that are working on a fundamental structured program moving forward will have an increase between 25 and 42% of their revenue annually, purely based on those additional decarbonization revenue streams that would be achieved. But what does it look like if we get all of this right? Well, first of all, it's balanced, and that's the bottom left-hand side of here. So we've got a 75% plus one decarbonization scenario, and it's balanced. And ironically, if you read an article recently, the oil and gas sector is expecting government to subsidize their decarbonization approach by up to 75%. We don't see that happening whatsoever. And the reason being is that decarbonization can actually be a positive net revenue generator. You may achieve some of that subsidization, but I think it's going to be a very hard sell in terms of a position that is not only relevant around the province, but it's relevant internationally, and everyone's in exactly the same boat here. So decarbonization is seen, and to some extent politically, as also an economic stimulus, be it right or wrong. Nonetheless, that is there. So ironically, that 75% plus one, which is thresholds that we have published sort of at least three and a half years ago, seems to tie up, and it's ironic that it's sitting at exactly the same level. So what does a successful outcome look like? Well, technology is as a result of an energy mix. There's an integrated energy mix that's producing a new product. There's peripheral aspects around decarbonization that's been a positive input in your business. We've seen that the thresholds of decarbonization of 75% plus one has been met or exceeded. We understand that the basis of the energy modeling process, or the decarbonization model that is developed, we've seen scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions included in that discussion. We've seen the generation of decarbonized revenue streams materializing. We see a significant off-balance sheet position. So it means that the funding that's available for decarbonization, it's not a grant, it's funding that's available that gives you that positive revenue stream within your business, has been taken off balance sheet. And for the interim period, when we talk about interim, we're talking about a few years while your organization is getting up to speed on decarbonization, and of course not detracting from your core business, that your core business suffers because you're spending so much time on decarbonization. These companies have looked at this as an outsourced solution in terms of decarbonizing their product and their brand, but allowing them to concentrate on the core business within the oil and gas sector, which is effectively extracting oil and gas. And of course, this also relates to the refineries downstream in the way that they obviously going to be repositioning to stay relevant to the market around them. And then it's all about that end-to-end value proposition. There's no one aspect here which is standalone, which is isolated, which is in a silo. It's about looking at that whole package from start to finish. If it's just a single technology that you're looking at, you're guaranteed to fail in your decarbonized strategy within these top two graphs. And again, just to reiterate the point that it's non-core business, non-core capex, and those are the decisions that you're starting to make now. So at this level, the risk is mitigated. So what does it look like? Very quickly before we get into a Q&A session, it's all about balanced decarbonization. Is it about the products or the methodology? Well, it's actually about both, and it's so much more. Is it about beneficiation? Certainly it is, right? It's about taking your natural gas supply, potentially converting that to a low carbon hydrogen, which can be done very successfully on site today, right? Both pre as well as post combustion. Decarbonized revenue streams, that is the net positive return in terms of your oil and gas operation. The annuity model, what does that mean? Well, it becomes an annuity model. It's no longer a capex-driven decision within your business. The capex is handled externally through an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, and you have an annuity stream coming into your business. But at the same time, you have a annuity stream that you can monetize in terms of your brand currency and the market that you're developing through your adjusted product, which becomes very important. All these aspects here, from technology to thresholds, is what we've been discussing. And this all pushes into a decarbonized third space, which is really the successful strategy and approach and the step here that needs to be taken to achieve an end-to-end decarbonized value proposition for your company as well as for your clients. So how would you typically do this? Well, to have a package solution, you require a very structured approach. First of all, the macro positioning for a changing environment. You need to understand where you sit in terms of the decarbonization index. We've developed a decarbonization index that is being utilized, I wouldn't say broadly today, but it's definitely been taken up in terms of understanding your decarbonization position. Our ability and the market's ability, whoever delivers a successful decarbonization strategy and the ability to implement it, has a lot to do with scenario planning, and it's got to do with the spread of probabilities, because there are many right answers, but it's all about the probability that option C outperforms, for example, option B and option D. Independent project assessments, absolutely key. That's got to do with projects that are already commissioned on the ground. We need to understand those fundamentals as to what's happening there. Integrated outcomes and roadmap. I mean, this is all about an end-to-end approach. It's about integrating. That's how you achieve your net positive revenue out of that process. And then contractor timelines. You need a very clear position. And if there was to be a grant available for decarbonization, it's going to be provided to structure. It's going to be allocated to structure with a very clear implementation strategy and activity that is taking place. And once again, it's all about that package solution, which is absolutely key here. There's no standalone solutions. There's no isolated solutions. There are no siloed solutions here. It's a complete end-to-end package solution that provides that ultimate solution. And this is not just at a company level, this is at a government level, it's at a provincial level as to how we need to think about this, how we need to go about it. That informs policy, it informs regulation, and it allows for practical uptake. We have a phenomenal opportunity in Alberta to become the epicenter of decarbonization and professional services across Canada, the rest of North America, and many other parts of the world. That's how big the opportunity is sitting here, provided we do this right at home And it's not about tomorrow, it's about today. In the hydrogen sector, there's a bit of a joke. You do your R&D, your technical pilot, your commercialization, your commoditization, and your operation and maintenance effectively all within the same 24-hour period. That's how quickly it is currently developing today. So what's important in terms of this slide here, and this is the last slide, it's got to do with dollars per barrel, the oil price, expenditures, revenues. This is what we're fixing here in terms of the decarbonization process. Ironically, the oil and gas sector has been extremely volatile, but decarbonization really provides an opportunity here for stability, for consistency, for sustainability in the way that we think about things, and we drive our process forward. Right. So that brings us to the end of the slide deck, and what I'd like to propose now, Mary Leanne, is that we open the floor. Let us understand the questions that would like to be asked, and see if we can take the last few minutes. A 60-minute session is quite cramped, but we've got 14 minutes left, and let's try and deal with a few questions. So ask if there's any particular questions at this point in time. The session appears to be opened, and you're welcome to post questions in the chat section, or you're welcome to come online personally and put those questions forward. Can I confirm that the room is currently open?
I think, Gareth, you have a question on how do you plan a transition when you don't know what you are transitioning to?
Yep. So that's a great question, Suhail. And the reality that we sit with is that the onset of decarbonization is here to stay. It's not a question of if it's going to happen. It is guaranteed to happen. And the question is more about the timeline that it's going to happen in. So those federal targets that have been set are relevant to an extent, but most importantly, decarbonization is driven bottom up through the market. So it's your audience and your client that's going to be dictating that. So through a structured approach, you can develop a really grounded strategy to get to that 75% plus one threshold. And once you're at that threshold, you would be able to handle those uncertainties within the market. But you're quite right, there's a substantial amount of uncertainty. But one scenario is do nothing and hope for the best. The other scenario is taking a proactive step, because we know for a fact that it's here. And the intensity around decarbonization has probably been accelerated by COVID by at least 10 years. Thank you for the question, Suhail. There's a gentleman by the name of Paul on the call. Manalili. Paul, please proceed. I see you're currently muted. Paul, we've activated your mic on our side. You just need to unmute yourself. Paul, can I ask you to look at the bottom left-hand side of your screen? There's a microphone there. If you click on your microphone, you will unmute yourself. And Bruce, I'm not sure if you've got a question, but please proceed.
I was the one that, can you hear me? I was the one that asked the question before about what are you transitioning to? And that kind of comes back to your comments about top down versus bottom up. The bottom up doesn't know what they're doing yet. And one of the first things the bottom should be doing is improving energy efficiency or getting cars off the road. Whenever I see a project where they said they're going to get 1 million cars off the road, I said, well, why don't you just go get the 1 million cars off the road? So before we start doing this, we really need to understand what's going to be happening on the bottom. And so far, like you've said, nobody's addressed that. So that's why I have a concern about how do we know what to transition to and plan for that. when we don't have a clue if anybody's going to have the guts to tell people they can't drive cars anymore.
Great, thank you, Bruce. That's a really well positioned question, and you're welcome to put your cameras on as well. Just in terms of that uncertainty around the bottom up, that is precisely where the risk is sitting today. And I'll give you a very simple example. If you take an organization such as Costco, just as one arbitrary example, their decarbonization strategy is as simple as a change in the procurement policy that goes upstream to their suppliers and says to them, and it's no different for the oil and gas sector, you've got 24 to 36 months to meet these decarbonization objectives. So when we talk about bottom up, there's two definitions here. The bottom up is in terms of the uptake at the grassroots level, and grassroots is probably the wrong term here, but it's at that bottom of that value, or the value proposition, and there needs to be direction there. But the risk that you run is that dictation for decarbonization is running bottom up. Right, so it's no longer a decision that a corporation is making in terms of when they're planning to decarbonize. You're being dictated to that the level of decarbonization needs to be achieved by this date and by how much. So when we refer to bottom up, it's actually more about the risk that is sitting there, and that bottom up, that fundamental, that baseline environment, if I can call it that, is already dictating as to what's going to happen. And that's why you see the prevention of the establishment of new refineries. That's why you see huge $14 billion LNG projects cancelled. It's due to the fact that there isn't going to be a market for that product within coming years, purely based on the level of emissions that's currently being presented. Bruce, does that offer a slightly different perspective on your question?
I guess it does. It's talking to a bit of a different issue, but a lot of those issues too, like you see the UK saying they're not going to develop any more North Sea oil and gas, and yet their demand isn't dropping at all for oil and gas. So that just means they're offshoring it. And that does nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It may actually increase it. So a lot of the objectives that the public is demanding and sort of governments are demanding don't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They just change where the oil and gas is coming from, which is totally counterproductive.
So what you're saying, you're basically just shifting the issue, and in many respects that is completely true. The important thing here is that through a change in mindset, even for the oil and gas sector, our clients that we operate with in the oil and gas sector today, pretty diverse. Some are entering into terms of power purchase agreements within the local utility environment, but a low carbon power supply. And the reason for that is that there's a premium associated with that. And we've got other clients within the oil and gas which have got quite an active and a very aggressive change in strategy around their natural gas supply and what they're doing with that, but into the hydrogen economy. So through doing that and with the correct carbon mitigation strategies, you are reducing that risk associated with not decarbonizing or not moving towards a potential net zero within years or decades to come. But it's about a repositioning. And through the repositioning, you create this positive revenue streams, and you can move out of the risk of a traditional fossil fuel environment, and you move into a new age environment, which actually speaks to a net zero, a decarbonized environment. And with our clients in the oil and gas sector today, that's what we actively developing every single day in terms of the repositioning of their particular businesses.
Yeah, I guess I was also thinking of, a lot of companies are, well, in Alberta, we're already switching to cogeneration, natural gas cogeneration as being our base power supply, and totally getting rid of coal. And that one of the things that does is also improves efficiency and improves economics for the oil sands project. So that's something that is driven by a good business practice. The other things like going to a hydrogen economy, that just creates more natural gas sales. If you're creating the hydrogen from steam methane reforming, you're just increasing the consumption of natural gas because the inefficiency of converting from methane to hydrogen for the same end user. So you're actually creating demand for natural gas instead of reducing it, which is good for the natural gas producers. But at some point, somebody's got to realize that and build that into the models, which I don't see people doing.
But we're currently doing that, and we understand that natural gas is going to have a very active role for many years, and it'll be one of the last sort of traditional fossil fuel type of supplies, or rather broader categories in terms of emissions that will be phased out, as it has benefits today, as you correctly mentioned, as a comparison to, for example, coal. But there's of course great opportunity in what you can do with the natural gas, for example, in the conversion to hydrogen. And when we talk about decarbonization, we talk about net zero. So we currently work with 7 different avenues of decarbonization potentials to reach that net zero. It's not just about what you do on site. There's a number of other mechanisms that can be applied. So the oil and gas sector is here to stay for some time, but it's all about decarbonizing and how we do that in terms of incremental steps to achieve that successfully. So I think we're very much saying the same thing. And the only thing we're adding on to that discussion, Bruce, is that if it's structured, you can do things exponentially better in terms of meeting your net zero and just adapting your business. And through that adaptation, you actually run the probability, and it's a very high probability of increasing your revenue between 25 to 42%, with taking all the outliers out of the data within the 36 months period time frame. So that's quite aggressive, and the reality of that is brought upon by decarbonization. So it's not a negative process. It can be a very positive process provided it's structured correctly.
So you have actually, Gareth, you have another question. Does ESSNA work with low carbon alternatives other than hydrogen?
Thank you, Suhail, and I believe that's a question out of the chat room.
Yes.
And that comes from a gentleman by the name of Joe Slater. So yes, our process is very much technology agnostic. When we started, we just so happened to have quite a fast growing hydrogen division, which is 5-9 hydrogen, but we work with a multitude of technologies. We are preferred implementation partners and integrators with a number of global OEMs of some very well-known brands. We are busy with, although we're not a great fan of gas engines, we're busy with a gas engine project now for one of the world's largest dairies. And we're doing an integration of various feedstocks into that process to reduce the emissions of that particular process. So the short answer there, Joe, is yes, we do. And our value that we provide is that we remain technology agnostic. So we're not trying to drop a box, because that would then be a technology approach. We rely on the model to dictate what that energy mix needs to look like. I hope that answers your question, Joe. Great.
We have probably time for one more question, I guess. So let me pose this question. I think Bruce was very right in terms of if this decarbonization only happens in, say, countries like Canada, etc., then essentially is a lose-lose for the world, because then you are pushing the source to Russia and Nigeria, where they don't really care about their emissions, and there would be economic gain. So that what is going to happen is going to actually, because of cutting production in Canada, you actually are going to push the price up for Canadian consumers. At the same time, you are increasing global greenhouse gas emissions. So the bottom line is that this decarbonization would require global collaboration. How do you see that this is happening?
Yeah, okay, really an excellent question, and we deal with this all the time. My first comment on that is that our decarbonization approaches, the implementation, the funding of that, all produces a net positive revenue stream, annuity revenue stream for the client that we in partnership with and we're operating with. So number one, if there's an economic stimulus in it, if there's a positive gain, positive cash flow out of it, and there's profitability, naturally through that process, there's an uptake. The other reality that we sit with is that if you don't participate in terms of decarbonization, moving towards a net zero, you will naturally exclude yourself from the global market. So we already see in sub-Saharan Africa that there's considerable participation now and drive to be actively involved in terms of decarbonization. It may not happen as quickly as the Western world, but it's certainly going to happen. And if you don't participate, you're going to be excluding yourself out of the process. So the reason that carbon credits failed over many years is that, number one, there was so much uncertainty. There wasn't really any sort of legal tangibility or legal teeth in the process right from the early days of the Kyoto Protocol. So that was a big issue. But that complicated the environment too much. So we've got 29 mechanisms, we've got 65 or 66 trading platforms today, and it doesn't make sense. But that's also been resolved through a very simplified mechanism that's starting to take shape now internationally. So that whole aspect about the global market, the participation of the global market, is actually driven by economics. And this is where a huge misconception comes in terms of decarbonization. Decarbonization is a business tool for a new revenue stream moving into a new era. It's not a pure cash outflow within the decarbonized environment. So Suhail, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. I think that was great. So I think this kind of essentially gets us to conclude this session. I want to thank you, Gareth. You did an outstanding job making that presentation. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And again, for the rest of the audience, you are going to receive an email in terms of today's technology information session performance, and the PowerPoint presentation will be also posted on our website. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Cyril, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I wish everybody a peaceful afternoon, and all the best with your decarbonization strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.
Yes. Bye-bye.